pilgrims, the guys with the tall black hats and the buckles, a humorless lot. And they had a very particular belief, and this was the idea of predestination. Predestination is basically that God already knows if you're saved or not. Right? God knows everything. He knows if he's going to send you to hell. He knows if he's going to send you to heaven. And so nothing you do matters. God has already made a decision. So if you're screwed, you're screwed. If you're saved, you're saved. There's nothing you can do about it. Well, this created some problems because this changed how people saw the world. Now, several things that Calvinism did. The first one is that it created a literate public. People actually had to learn how to read. In the Middle Ages, you didn't have to learn how to read. You could go into a cathedral, you could look at the pictures and the stained glass windows, and you could basically get the idea. Right? Draw me a picture. But these Protestant Reformation said basically, look, we don't need priests, we don't need the church, we don't need this big Catholic church, right? All you have to do is read the Bible. Okay, the Bible will tell you that's the Word of God, and if you read the Bible, you'll know what you're supposed to do. But guess what? If you're going to have people read the Bible, they have to learn how to read. And so the Protestants encouraged a lot of people to become readers. And so you had a literate population, which means you could have a division of labor, because people could read and coordinate with each other, and they didn't necessarily have to be talking or looking at each other. They could write instructions and do different tasks in different places. The second was this idea that that work is prayer and prayer is work. That you didn't just have to be a monk and leave society and spend all day in a monastery and pray if you wanted to make God happy. God liked people who worked hard. And the Latin saying is laborare est orare. And this comes from the rule of St. Benedict. And he said basically to pray is to work is to pray. So if you work really hard, then, God is happy with you. And so these Protestants thought, look, if we work hard, okay, if we never take time off, if we always work 60 hours a week or 80, 90 hours a week, God will smile on us because he'll say, geez, look at all these people working so hard down there. Well, the Calvinists also, but they made money, but they didn't want to spend it because you didn't want to spend it on things like fancy clothes or good food, because that was a bad thing. That was against their religion. So if you think about the Amish, right? If you never go to Lancaster, Pennsylvania and look at the Amish, you'll notice, first of all, they don't have ties. Why don't they have ties? Because ties are useless objects. It's all about fashion. It's not about anything useful. The tie doesn't serve any function. It's just a piece of color on your neck, and so don't wear ties. You'll also notice that they don't have buttons. And why don't they have buttons? Well, buttons were used for dueling, because you would hide your sword, you would hide your gun inside your buttons in your vest, and you would pull it out. So they don't have buttons. So that was another thing. They don't have useless things. So they don't want to spend money. So what do you do with all this money you've made by working so hard? Well, you invest it. So what it means invest, it means you go and grow your business so you can make more money. And the last thing that they wanted was this idea of rational calculation. They were so worried that God was about to damn them that they wanted to make the only way you could tell whether you were saved or not was whether you were working hard and whether you were making money. If you were making money, that means God smiled on you. But if you weren't working hard, you probably wouldn't make money. But they wanted to calculate it. They want to add up. Every single cent they had meant they were closer to heaven. And so they saved pennies, and basically if you weren't working hard all the time, if you were idle, this was idle hands of the devil's work. Time is money. So they invented a few other things that were pretty important to the modern world, particularly mechanical clocks. You can't calculate how much you work. You can't pay people by the hour unless you can measure time. And before the Protestant Reformation, you had bell towers, right? The bells would ring at noon or 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. and then you would stop and you would pray. but it wasn't very exact, because guess what? When you have sun clocks, the days in the winter are shorter than the days in the summer. The hours change, and so you can't really calculate it very well. And in the Muslim world, you had minarets where people would have the call to prayer, but it was a very inexact science because you were depending upon the length of the day, and that changed from day to day and from season to season. So the Protestants invented mechanical clocks, clocks that were accurate and consistent all the time. Now they could measure how much they're working, and let's say you could really have the concept that time is money. All this came out of the Protestant Reformation. So that leads us to the 19th century, the 1800s. And these ideas in economics, this idea that, vice is good, competition is good, it's all about, competition will make us all better, even if we lose, even if we're the ones who get thrown into the dustbin of history. And then this led to ideas of laissez-faire or social Darwinism. The idea that society is not just biology, not just nature, but societies were driven by these natural laws of competition. And any interference with these laws, like if you protected the weak, then there wasn't really competition, and that would screw up society. And so they really believe these ideas of survival of the fittest, and the market is about natural selection. The market decides who's fit and who's not fit, and that competition is basically a natural way of the world. And so these people who are advocates of social Darwinism and laissez-faire were seen as progressive reformers, like Thomas Malthus. It's really, forward-thinking and progressive that thinks you shouldn't give food to a starving person. Or it's very progressive to take people's jobs away and give them to foreigners. And this was the morality of the 1800s, particularly in England, but in many other places, including the United States. But this idea of laissez-faire played out in different ways in different places. Because there was always one part of society that there were three basic resources. And let me just take a step back here. Three basic resources. Land, right? We all know what land is. Labor, that means your work. And capital, basically money. And in different countries, one of these was scarce. So, for example, in the United States, we had a lot of land, right? We had all the American West. We had lots of land. We didn't actually have that many people, and we didn't have a lot of money. We borrowed all our money from England for most of early American history. If you're a country like England, right, you didn't have a lot of land. Land was scarce. You had a lot of workers, and guess what? You also had a lot of money. And in other countries, you might have had a lot of rich people, but not a lot of land and not a lot of workers. And so you had different combinations in different places. And the reason I'm saying this is that in social Darwinism, it was always about breaking down someone's control. Someone had a monopoly, and you had to break up that monopoly. So in England, the monopoly were the landowners because they had the scarce resource. And the land was mostly owned by nobles. For example, in Ireland, they had these big estates, and they controlled all the land, and they wanted to graze their sheep or raise grain. And that gave them a lot of power because that meant they could keep out all the imported grain from the United States or from France or from other places. And they could charge everyone in England high food prices. Well, guess what? In England, people who were working in the factories weren't very happy about this, right? Because they had to pay higher prices for their food. And because they had to pay high prices for their food, they went to their managers, the people who own the factories, these Manchester industrialists down in the right-hand corner, and they said, look, you have to pay us more money, because if you don't pay us money, we're going to starve and die. And so what happened is that in England, you got labor and capital working together. They kind of combined in the 1800s, and they fought against the privileges of the English nobility, these big landowners who owned these estates and grew all the food. And this is also kind of what happened in Sweden as well. And the combination where the owners of the factories and the workers in the factories kind of combined against, let's say, rural interests of big landowners. This led to social democracy, this idea of we all belong to society and we need to help each other out. And you get a relative universal health care in England and the social welfare state in Sweden and Scandinavia. and you get a very livable society. And so this is kind of the path to modernity that was taken in England. Well, let me show you what happened in the United States. In the United States, the scarce resource was capital. Right? There wasn't actually a lot of money in the United States compared to the amount of land, or for that matter, the amount of people we had. We had lots of immigrants. We had a large country that wasn't really filled in yet. Yes, I know there were Native Americans, but they weren't really part of this economic system at that time. But they had very little money for development. Most of the money in the United States came through New York City and was borrowed in England. So basically we are importing capital. We were importing money from England, putting it to work in the United States. And this gave, let's say, people in New York City and the robber barons and the people who controlled money in the 1800s a lot of power. And what you got was land and labor unions in the cities, poor farmers in the rest of the country. You might know this is populism. This was, let's say, William Jennings Bryan saying, "You will not crucify us on you will not crucify us on this cross of gold." And they were like for free silver. So they wanted to break the power of the money interests, mostly concentrated in New York. And this led to the type of politics we have in the United States, which is popular democracy. Right? We believe, everyone is voting, everyone is equal. It's kind of always a have versus have-nots. We have the rich, basically Republican Party interest versus the Democrats who are supposedly representing the people. Neither of these is exactly true, but basically this is how politics works in the United States, and also why, we find it very difficult to provide for social welfare in the United States, to provide basic services like universal health care, pensions, things of that sort, because we always have this battle between the rich and the poor in American politics. Now, in other countries, you had very strong trade unions. So particularly Germany and Japan, where you had, let's say, very little skilled labor. And so they actually had a lot of power because in Germany and Japan, there were only so many people with, let's say, high-level skills. And they were able to, let's say, create unions and charge high prices for their labor. Well, guess what? So there was a lot of what happened in Germany and Japan was they had to break the power of the working classes. So you got what was called in Germany the Alliance of Iron and Rye. Iron was these industrialists who were making these big foundries like Krupp, Chemical, IG Farben. All these things would be later involved with the Nazis in one way or another. And the Junkers. The Junkers were these big landowners in Prussia who grew rye. And they basically got together and, beat up on organized labor. And both in Japan and Germany, this is where basically fascism and Nazism come from. The idea of breaking down the power of working people and the combined interest of large landowners who are very traditional and these big money capitalists getting together, organizing to crush organized labor because they have so much market power. And so what you have is land and capital organizing against labor, and this is basically a path to fascism. Most of the fascist countries basically had this organization of society, and it had a lot to do with how economics looked like